I am Sara.
And I'm Rena, and welcome to
Biopic, a podcast story. This is a podcast where we dissect the good, the bad, the ugly, and absurd of this specific genre of motion picture, the biopic. If you want to learn more about us, our scoring system, and how we choose movies, please check out our special introductory episode titled Introduction, Who Are We and What Are We Doing?
Sara, what movie are we doing this week?
This week, we will be talking about The Duchess. And Rena, can you give us the trigger warning?
This movie contains depictions of addictive behavior, including gambling and alcohol, spousal neglect, period-typical misogyny, what we would now consider to be child marriage, spousal rape, emotional abuse, misogyny, and very big hair.
Yeah, that covers it. And Rena, can you also please give us the spoiler warning?
Spoiler warning. We are going to spoil everything, including possibly the major plot points in works of narrative art having nothing to do with this particular movie. Consider yourself warned.
Sources used in this episode include Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire by Amanda Foreman, the podcast Dan Snow's History Hit episodes 300 Years of Prime Ministers Part 1, and also our old faithful resource frockflix.com and recycledmoviecostumes.com, and also the website Gossamer Obsessions that looks at the history of this film. And Rena, can you please tell us a little bit more about Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire?
Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, was born in 1757 at Althorpe House, United Kingdom. Her father was the Earl of Spencer. She is distantly related to Princess Diana, who was also a daughter of an Earl of Spencer. She was engaged at 16 to William Cavendish, 5th Duke of Devonshire. So we get to sing our child marriage song. Ready? She was only 16, which still makes her 4 years older than Ty Cobb's mother, 3 years older than Loretta Lynn, and 3 years older than Gandhi and his wife.
Who would want to marry this old hag? I mean, seriously.
Yes, her husband was 24 when they married, and as we'll see in this, they were not a great match from the go. Georgiana's parents had been a true love match. She'd hoped it was a case of still waters running deep when it appears to be more of a case of still waters running still. She became about as big of a political player as a woman who could not vote could be. She was famous as a fashion trendsetter. She was friends with Marie Antoinette, which we don't see here. She had numerous affairs, several children. She was also a hardcore gambling addict, which I'm going to touch on because it's fascinating, even though we don't, again, see that much of it in the movie. She died at the age of 48 from a liver thing. Her lover and one-time baby daddy, Charles Grey, is the namesake behind Earl Grey tea. While we have no corpse capers this week, there is a famous portrait of her by Thomas Gainsborough that was twice stolen and went on the lam for decades before the Devonshire family finally bought it back.
I'm glad that it was just a painting and not her body.
Yeah, I think her body has remained intact in wherever the Dukes of Devonshire get buried.
That's nice. That's, as we know from this show, not a given.
Not at all. So, Sara, can you please tell us a little bit about the movie The Duchess, starring Keira Knightley? I'll start by saying that it won an abundantly well-deserved Oscar for Best Costume Design.
Absolutely. The Duchess is a 2008 historical drama. It's directed by Saul Dibb, who co-wrote the screenplay with Jeffrey Hatcher and Anders Thomas Jensen. It's based on the book Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire by Amanda Foreman. The budget was £13.5 million, which translates into roughly $20 million US. And the film grossed 43 million worldwide, so it was a success. You mentioned the Oscar for costumes, which I agree was richly deserved. It was also nominated for art direction. And it stars Miss Knightley, Ralph Fiennes, Haley Atwell, Charlotte Rampling, and Dominic Cooper. And it did receive a spate of nominations and awards for various, Brit Film Awards and things like that as well. So it was pretty well regarded in its time.
There were two different movies they could have chosen to make, and as we know, we approve of when they narrow the focus in on a small part of someone's life, but they chose to tell an emotional romantic story, and I did appreciate it being on the shorter side, but there was another one they could have chosen to tell, which was more of her as the political animal. And when she was sent away to have her bastard daughter, she was sent to the continent. She was close friends with Marie Antoinette from way back. She visited Marie Antoinette in the Tuileries when, things were really closing in. She was a more fascinating person than is portrayed here. She was friends with lots of really interesting people, like the playwright Sheridan, who you see. He's sort of like the English Moliere, but he's a big deal, and he had an affair with her sister Harriet, who's basically cut from here. I would have told this as an 8-episode prestige drama soap opera because there's stuff going on with her sister. There's multiple lovers. In real life, she was 30 when she met Charles Grey, and he was 23. So she was a little bit of a cougar by the standards of the day. And there's the sort of menage a trois that we see with her husband and Bess Foster. Bess Foster is either an incredibly manipulative and adept player, or shares a certain degree of spectruminess with the Duke in the version we see here, in that she'd have to either plan to overstate things, or she's just making a faux pas. I did think it was an accurate portrayal of all the things that made the Duke kind of a cold fish in the biography. But the film they chose to make was the one that was less of a Rena movie than the one that I would have seen. And there's all sorts of things with people being married, with bad marriages and affairs, and so many fascinating smaller stories that in order to tell one cohesive romantic tale, you don't see that.
It's a really weird observation for me to make after I bitched and moaned both the week up to and having to watch Gandhi and then on the show about it, because this was one of those films that I was like, this feels like there's so many things that feel half realized or not realized at all in terms of the story. And I wanted more of them. These people are trashy AF and messy AF. I do love that. I love messy people and I love disastrous people. And I really dug that aspect of it. And I would have liked to see something longer, to your point, like an 8-episode series or 2-part miniseries or something. Like they're just, you could feel the choice to leave stuff on the floor. I was like, oh, look, the unedited version of this almost shows Ralph Fiennes' stem. I was like, hey, whoa, I don't remember this from when we went to see this. But I felt like there were things that I would have liked to dig into more in some form or fashion, and be that in a more digestible format or a 2-parter or something like that. But I didn't want to leave her world because I wanted to understand more. And I feel like the film just didn't have the space to tell us all of that.
And if you read Amanda Foreman's biography, which is really engrossing, and I wouldn't have thought that a book about a socialite would be that good, but there's so much else going on. And these are the people Jane Austen was making fun of. Also, as an aficionado of royalty and aristocracy, and it is my great regret in life that I cannot be addressed as Your Grace because I am not a duchess, and I would have loved that shit. You know it.
I do know that.
Yes. So things you might not be aware of. When she marries a duke, there are 5 titles to the peerage, and you can remember it as, do men ever visit Boston? So it goes. Duke, Marquis, earl, viscount, baron. And then beneath that, there are baronets who are addressed as sir. If your father is a duke, a marquis, or an earl, you are automatically lord or lady so-and-so. If your father is merely a viscount or a baron, you are the honorable. If you are an eldest son and your family has other titles, you get to be a marquis or an earl or whatever title is under daddy's the minute you're born. And I thought the sets on this were remarkable. I don't blame the Spencers for not letting them film at Althorpe. They have another place standing in as Althorpe. I don't know what the story on that is. I could also understand if, since this film sort of is cashing in on drawing parallels to Diana wherever it can, I can understand if they didn't want to be a part of it. The actual Devonshire house, if you look up pictures of it, it was torn down in, I think, the 1930s, and it was ugly. And I am someone where, I hate anything new. I will absolutely fight to keep whatever beautiful ornamented thing someone's going to replace with a fugly, plain, modern building. And no, I do not care if the potential architect was named Frank Lloyd Wright or Mies van der Rohe. But if you look at pictures of Devonshire House, it is ugly. It's apparently the insides were gorgeous, but it's like a block of dark brick with itsy bitsy windows on the top floor that resemble the narrowed eyes of people with small souls. Look it up and tell me it's not ugly.
I'm about to, because that is a very specific description. Okay, what was it called?
Devonshire House, London. And Somerset House, which is standing in for it, is much more beautiful and does a better job of conveying how people lived.
Yeah, that has big, like orphanage energy.
Yeah.
With, as you point out, the two small windows, which would also keep the children in. Yeah, it's not a great looking building.
I don't think it was any loss to London architecture, and I grieve for every single building destroyed by the Blitz.
It's so sad.
And the buildings destroyed in the Great Fire in 1660-something. I like old stuff.
I do have a real question for you here. There's two political parties, the Tories, who have been consistently the Tories the whole time, and then the Whigs. What is a Whig?
So the Whigs are the political party that preceded the Liberals, who preceded Labour. And you see that in the film where they are talking about freedom and extending the vote. Because at the time, not only could women not vote, but men who did not own property that was above a certain value could not vote, which meant that less than 5% could vote in House of Commons elections. And this was in part because of something called a rotten borough.
Please tell me what a rotten borough is.
A rotten borough was a borough that at the time that all of the parliamentary seats were drawn, maybe it had people living in it, but more and more had moved out over the years. So the worst example was a borough known as Old Sarum that had like 3 people living in it. A rotten borough with 3 people in it sent someone to parliament, while people sitting around renting could not.
So South Dakota might qualify as a rotten borough. The amount of power that they have is not representative, is not representative of the number of people that they have. And there's a fundamental unfairness to that in terms of the way the desires of the country overall are represented in a parliamentary system or in a Congress.
But they don't get rid of this until, I think it's 1832, they finally get rid of rotten boroughs. So the Whigs are talking about it, but it takes a while to implement. And extending universal manhood suffrage past property owners, because there's that scene where Fox says moderately free, as in we're not we're not talking about letting every man vote. And
we haven't quite gone down the road of landowners, but in a way we have. Citizens United is just as much garbage.
The Whigs are in the slot that Labour currently fills as the more liberal-leaning party. They're the ones who are saying, we need to get rid of slavery, or let's not keep up this war in the colonies. And Charles James Fox, who we see here, will be portrayed subsequently in, I think it's called Amazing Grace, where it's about Wilberforce and the battle to end slavery in the British Empire. We don't know him at all in America, and he's sort of forgotten because he never got to be prime minister.
I thought I was going to hate him. The film pulled an interesting bait and switch with this character because I thought like he was given sort of a villain edit at first, and then that turned around very quickly, and he was a lovely ally to her.
That scene where she's drunk and he's not trying to take advantage, and in real life they were lovers at one point. One of the things about him is he was short, rotund, and hairy, and he had these enormous bushy black eyebrows.
This sounds like someone I would want to date, but go on.
He would be a great Michael Stuhlbarg role, but he was actually irresistible to women, even though he wasn't like that attractive, because he was just one of these people who exudes confidence and energy and super charismatic. And I think he had that thing that Diego Rivera has going on in Frida, where they're physically unattractive, but they look at you like all your flaws are perfection. So he had a big track record with the ladies. He was an inveterate gambler. I have some things from Amanda Foreman about, because they also don't touch on the depths of gambling addiction in this the way that I'd hoped.
No, they keep, like, at one point her mother says to her, like, you need to cut back on your gambling. And I was like, she does?
So in this podcast, we have Rena movies and we have Sara movies. This is a Rena film more so than it is a Sara film. I love a frock flick. It has all the things I love. Sumptuous costuming with corsets and enormous skirts, lush aristocratic scenery, and it's set in an era distant enough that I can really lose myself in another time, because any connections to miserable 21st century American politics are too many degrees removed to distress me. I was thinking about it here, and the thread running from Gandhi to here is one where the flip side of reaching for a sense of spiritual purity through aesthetic obsession is to throw oneself into addictive behavior in a race for blissful blankness. And a word on the costumes, which are amazing.
Yes.
And I will probably watch this movie again another 2 or 3 times over the course of the next few decades just for the costumes. One of the things that I love about films set this far back is that the wardrobe department really has to work in a way that they don't if it's set in the last 6 decades and they can rely on vintage. Unlike movies set in the past century, you cannot source authentic things for something this far back, because anything that is actually from that time is far too fragile to be worn as in a museum. Can't be tailored for modern actors. As it is, the modern copies are so expensive to make that they are typically sold to a costuming house like Cosprop in the UK, where they are repurposed for decades. A note on authenticity, like Marie Antoinette, this is also an example of times when you have to change a few things so that characters who are supposed to be beautiful will register as such in modern eyes, specifically the hair. The real Georgiana liked to wear her hair 3 feet high off her head. You see this one time in that scene where she's on the balcony. Some things that 18th century trendsetters wore look too ridiculous to modern eyes, so it behooves the hair and makeup people to find a gentler means of paying tribute to the trends that haven't aged well. Like, the hair was powdered white. They wore very heavy, like, white and red makeup. The way that they would get the hair to stay that way is the hairdresser would come in, they'd do the powder, and then women would, like, sleep with their heads on boards to not disturb it. Sometimes they'd cut slits in the back so that if vermin got in, they could crawl out again. None of this is appealing. Like, you only do this if you want a character to be a joke. So you can't get to 100% accuracy on it, but you can pay tribute to it quite beautifully.
So gross. The details around vermin and stuff, I'm gonna barf. It's just always so horrifying where I'm like, oh God, there is suffering for fashion and there is suffering for fashion. And the letting animals take shelter in your hair so you can look good at a party is hardcore. So we open up on Miss Knightley, and I think my favorite piece of IMDb trivia ever, which I'm going to read to you right now, which this is the second period film starring Keira Knightley that opens with a view of her walking across grass carrying something. Because apparently she does the same thing in the opening of Pride and Prejudice. I'm very glad that someone has taken the time to clock this for the internet's purposes. That's how we open it. She's engaged in some spirited gambling amongst her friends, having men around race for them. And she's lively and clearly like a bright and engaged young woman. And then we cut inside and Charlotte Rampling, her mother, is talking to Ralph Fiennes, the Duke. And he's like, will she give me sons? And her mom promises that she will. And he's like, okay, cool, I'll take her. And that's how she ends up getting married. Note here, like, Ralph Fiennes is probably, I mean, he's an older gentleman at this point, but there was a very lengthy period of time, and I think he still is very attractive, where he was probably like one of the most beautiful men alive. And sometimes they managed to make him look so unattractive in movies. And this might be the least attractive I've ever seen him. And that includes Schindler's List.
What about the scenes in English Patient post-burning?
He's still got personality.
They did a good job capturing criticisms of the Duke in this. And they show, like, all of his passion and affection is for his dogs. There's things that both he and with Bess Foster, I don't know if it's studied or not, but that make me wonder if he's mildly spectrum-y. He's never going to get called on it because he's a duke. There's only 20 dukes out of hundreds of peers in Britain. He's a dull man.
Yeah, and he says as much too, which I appreciated the movie laying its cards out on the table at a certain point where he just says, like, yeah, what are you going to do about it? I'm a man and I own this land. Like, that's the beginning and the end of this conversation. Also, though, like, he likes the ladies, he likes to hook up, and he likes the conquest, and he, for reasons I don't understand, is completely uninterested in his own wife, despite the fact that his wife is Keira Knightley. But nevertheless, he's kind of like put off by her wheeze. So I had the option to watch this, to rent it from Amazon, the quote unedited version, which had a vaguely non-consensual sex scene right at the opening of it, where they get married and he's like, okay, lay down and I'm gonna hit that. It's uncomfortable and awful. And that's their relationship. And he's kind of like, I need to impregnate you, but he's always chasing other women. Yeah, he's just kind of a douche. He sucks. He's very, like, free of personality, and he knows what he is capable of getting away with. He doesn't seem to even, like, be aware of other people having feelings, which is probably part of, like, that's probably him being a product of the time period and his station in life. And yeah, so that's the start of their relationship.
Knightley does that thing of starting off as this, like, springy teenaged girl and becoming a woman over the course of the film. She made Anna Karenina a while after this, which is sort of like, here's what would have happened if Georgiana had left her husband. Spoiler, does not live happily ever after. And in real life, they had met at some spas on the continent, so I think she'd met him a few times more before he proposed. I love Charlotte Rampling in anything. The cast is really good. Given the story they chose to tell over the one they could have told, they acquit themselves quite well. So she's married off to him, and then one of the glimpses we have of how dirty everything was in the 18th century is the crowd of people running after carriage, because if you're at the very tippy top of the peerage, you're a celebrity, so it's just like now with the paparazzis, they could have done a better job showing how filthy everything was. Very few films have done this. We're so caught up in the glamour of big dresses.
Yeah, I'm not angry.
I'm not mad about it.
Yeah, I'm not angry at not having a bunch of like Bertolucci, like in 1900 style, like bad teeth or no teeth, or like, you know, like people who are 40 but look, you know, 95 kind of stuff in this. But yes, it is not an accurate depiction of the filth in which these people kind of like had to hover above just by virtue of the times. This scene, like them having sex for the first time, does have marital rape energy to it, but I don't know if it's all the way there. Like, he's definitely not a really engaged partner when it comes to being with her. I thought was so interesting is she's having tea with her mother later and talking about how like he's very disconnected to her. She's worldly about a lot of things, but I'm like, does no one have the talk about what sex is with these women before they get married in these like in these time periods? Like, I find that so fascinating. Like, they always seem like, oh, that was terrible. And I'm like, did no one tell you it was going to be terrible?
Have you ever heard the phrase, lie on your back and think of England?
Yes.
That's what they would tell them.
Not personally, but yes.
That is what girls would go to their wedding night being told, that someone would say he's going to do this to you with this, and it's going to be awful. And when she asked, how can I bear it? They would say, lie on your back and think of England, as in you're supposed to produce sons for England. There's this thing when they're taking her enormous, beautiful wedding gown off of her, where he talks about how hard it is to remove women's clothing. And I suppose that actually the practicality of women's clothing being difficult to remove back then was birth control was not very good. Having tons of clothing that was hard to take off was a way for a woman to protect herself from ruin. But where she says it's how we express ourselves, this is something I've still felt. As you know, I love dressing up. So putting myself together in a certain way or paying tribute to an era is a form of self-expression. I think this is something that women still take pleasure in. But she's operating in a time that was, as a craft, it was an area where a woman would express herself. But the Duke has never felt any need to express himself, despite nothing being closed to him. So that scene happens, and I loved that conversation that she has with her mother where she says, like, oh yes, why should I want to talk to my husband?
One of the things that I feel like we see throughout this, and they find ways to click on it in different ways, was the expectations on men versus the expectations on women in terms of how they engage with people and how they operate. Like, they throw this dinner party in a couple of scenes after this where it is a long table full of men talking about politics, the Duke on one end, her on the other. And he at one point decides that he's bored and he just gets up and leaves. And he's like, yeah, I can do that. You do what you want. And she has to go back and kind of reassure everyone that it's fine and keep hosting the dinner. And we see that a lot in this movie in different ways, where we see like she has to work harder, she has to be more, she has to be on, and he can just get away with like getting up and walking away if he's bored and go find a maid to have sex with while she continues to do the work and represent them. This is where she meets, what's his face? You talk about him.
Charles James Fox. He never got to be prime minister, but brilliant man of massive appetites, fascinating. We begin to see an allusion to some of the gambling here, but they really didn't dig into this in the way that I had hoped. So I'm going to read this anyway to show what we missed, because this was like a workmanlike script that was decent. The dialogue was plausible, but there was a richer story they could have told that I don't think it needed to be any more than 20 minutes longer. I think they chose to tell a smaller emotional story. So Speaking about the level of this man's gambling addiction, his father was a man named Lord Holland who indulged him in everything, didn't scold him for smashing a gold watch to see what would happen. Lord Holland's last act before he died had been to pay off his son's £140,000 in debt.
That's like $1 billion.
That £140,000 in debt, from a footnote here, is almost 8.5 million pounds in today's money. Lord Holland was deeply wounded by his son's behavior, but couldn't bear to remonstrate with him. "Never let Charles know how excessively he afflicts me," he begged. So he had gambled away an amount of money where we would consider ourselves set for life, never have to work again on it.
It's a lot of money.
It goes on to describe his addictive behavior, but also what made him brilliant. But this generous gift had no effect on Fox's behavior. He stayed up night after night, fighting his body's urge to sleep with coffee and platefuls of food. According to one anecdote, he played hazard continuously from Tuesday to Wednesday night, winning, losing, recovering, and finally losing all his money. He stopped on Thursday to rush to the House of Commons to participate in a debate on the 39 Articles of the Church of England, and went straight back to White's, that's a men's club where they gambled, afterwards. There he drank until Friday morning, when he walked to Almanac's, another one of these clubs, and gambled until 4 p.m. Having won £6,000, he rode to Newmarket, where he lost £10,000. Though he very quickly frittered away everything, Fox could always count on friends, including the Duke, to support him financially and politically. Occasionally he won money, but he avoided games of skill, which he was very good at, for the excitement of games of chance. He spent so many hours at Brooks's that he was rarely out of his gambling clothes. This is a brilliant, fascinating train wreck, and when they describe that no-sleep energy, it reminds me of how Bill Clinton would run himself ragged.
Yeah, smart people have to do that sometimes. They just work real hard and make themselves crazy.
And that he could, flip that switch of, okay, I'm going to stop everything, run to Parliament now, make these speeches, and then I haven't slept in 48 hours, I'm going to go gamble again. So that's the man that we've met.
Also, we're going real hard on the Princess Diana comparisons here. This movie does not shy away from alluding to that in terms of, you see her falling away from any illusion that she had about what her marriage is going to be, particularly at this moment that comes up after this where one of the housekeepers shows up with a small child named Charlotte, who is an orphan girl who is one of his children that's out in the world, whose mother died, and now she's going to be their child. And he says, you can practice with her, because then we pull back and reveal that that Georgiana is pregnant for the first time. And she be a welcoming mother to this child, which is lovely and probably wasn't always a thing that people did in these situations. And she takes to this little girl, and it's very sweet. She's a good mother. Except for the part where we see her incredibly pregnant at a gambling party, and she is drinking while pregnant, which those were the days, weren't they? And I actually thought the baby was going to be dead here when she went into labor.
Yeah, she had multiple miscarriages as well, which they mentioned briefly later. And this is from the story we could have seen. Georgiana agreed to give up dancing while she was pregnant, but she could not stop gambling. She herself could not explain the compulsion, nor did she know why it had grown worse since Bess's departure. This is later in the story. In April, the Duke at last began to take an interest in her financial plight and wrote out a note of credit for £1,300 to settle her debts. But instead of paying it to her bankers, she took the note with her to Mrs. Stewart's and gambled it away on top of a further £500. At the end of May, when Georgiana was 6 months pregnant, Lady Mary Coke heard that she had lost over £1,000 at Mrs. Hobart's and stayed until 6 a.m. trying to win it back. In July, with only a few weeks left before she came to turn, Georgiana was still in the grip of her mania. She sits up almost every night at Faro, wrote a friend. The Duke has paid £5,000 for her, and she owes 3 more. This is another pregnancy where she gambled. Georgiana could not even bring herself to think of how she might tell the Duke or her mother that her gambling debts amounted to at least £3,000. $297,000 in today's money, when her pin money, the allowance granted her by the Duke, came to £4,000 a year. Like everyone else, the Duke blamed the miscarriage on her reckless living.
She gives birth to a girl, and her husband describes the baby as a mishap. Men are just awesome. We start to see, and it comes on a little suddenly, like, again, I think because of the confines of the timeline here, she's starting to become more political. She says that she is going to feed the baby, which was very unusual for a woman of her stature at that time period. They had people who did that for you. And she's going to breastfeed the baby. And then she starts, speechifying a bit more. They go to Bath, where she is to recover and position her body in such a way that she will be able to give birth to male babies through recovering at Bath. And we meet Hayley Atwell, who is playing Bess
as Lady Bess Foster. She is in an abusive marriage, which was true. And she alludes to that it's legal for a man to beat his wife with a stick as long as the stick is no wider than his thumb. IRL, it was more emotional abuse. He'd cut her off with £300 a year, which is like nothing if you're an aristocrat.
We find out at a certain point that he has forbidden her to see their children.
She's either someone who gets the Duke being similarly spectrumy, or she's completely playing everybody. We don't know the precise nature of this menage was, because the Victorian descendants, when they were looking over Georgiana's letters, would black everything out, and it's indecipherable now. And this is an example of sometimes things can go backwards in history, that people in the 19th century were relatively less progressive than people in the 18th, however you want to call that progressive.
This relationship is like sister wifey and all that, but it does ultimately kind of work for them. It was like also lovely to see Hayley Atwell. She's a very good actress. She's wonderful. We spend some time at Bath, and Georgiana decides to invite her back to stay with them because she has been cut off from her family because of her abusive husband. And she says, we'll show you a great time. And we go to see the play School for Scandal, which was written about the Duke and Duchess. And the Duke seems hip to that because he's the only one not laughing at the play. And we run back into Mr. Grey, who we saw at the beginning, running around for gambling purposes. And he is very delighted to catch back up with Georgiana.
Again, her sister Harriet isn't in this at all, and this is one of the things where you could have made like a one-season soap thing. Sheridan has an affair with Harriet at one point. For everything they allude to, there are multiple fascinating ins and outs of with all sorts of people who are peripheral here. But Grey is happy to run into her again. He is a rising star politically. She comes out to support him and support Fox. The Duke is not interested in any of this. He's a man of small passion. Ralph Fiennes does a good job humanizing him at points because he does say later on, I don't like this either. I think he's like a product of his times, and he knows they're poorly matched. And there's this scene with Georgiana and Lady Bess where they're in bed, and she's like, well, imagine I'm Mr. Grey and I'm slowly... She's like, men don't do that, when Bess is talking about the concept of foreplay.
Who is this for, this scene? I was like, this is what men think women do all the time when they're by themselves, which is make out with each other. Georgiana is starting to realize that she really is into Charles Grey. Dominic Cooper is a good actor. I feel like he's not right for this. He looks too like a Gallagher brother. Like he should be in Oasis. He has too modern a face for this movie. Everyone in this movie, like all the men look like jackasses throughout because they've got on these stupid wigs. But his face is almost too modern for this movie. He doesn't have like the face of someone who is from the olden times.
You're right. I was just thinking that he has a very modern face. And I guess also so does Keira Knightley.
She's also so transcendently beautiful that it doesn't even matter. No one looks the way these people look in their paintings anymore. I've never come across anyone who looks like a portrait from the 1800s. All that said, she's going out and she starts stumping for him, and we're seeing her really come alive politically, and helping him on the campaign trail. And she comes home, and we find out that the Duke is doing a Diego Rivera here with Lady Elizabeth, hooking up with her only friend.
Bess has her argument where she says, this is how I get to see my kids. And my thought is, okay, yes, your children are definitely more important than your friendships. Your children are more important than your lover. Your children are more important than your spouse. But people are going to get hurt. So
this movie really shows the way that children are used as sort of as ransom and collateral and blackmail for these women because they have no agency of their own in terms of like ways to make their way through the world without these husbands and their husband's power. That's their bargaining chip every time with these women. Like she's doing this because she knows like that's how I can see my kid because he's so powerful. And also she likes him. I think that part of it, that's also a little convenient to say that because she clearly is also in love with him, but it is also a pathway for her to have the only power that she can. And we see this throughout this movie.
I had been thinking when he talks about his new daughter as a mishap, while again, all his affection is for his dogs. And there is this scene later that I loved where it says 6 years later after she has the daughter, and they're riding in separate carriages, and she has the 3 little girls opposite her, and he has his 2 dogs on the other seat.
Yeah.
I thought that was a great touch.
And also, like, he really doesn't get why she's upset about him hooking up with Lady Elizabeth. Like, he's like, what's the problem? And she's like, this is my only friend. You can have your fill of every single lady around here. And this was my friend. This is the only friend I have. You suck. He totally doesn't get it. And then she goes out for a walk with Charles. And she has a line that I loved here, which was, she's talking to him about her life, and she says, I feel like I've done some things in life too late and others too early. And I was just like, that is the truth, sister. It's awesome to be a woman. And then we cut back and she's having breakfast with her husband and his mistress, and they're all sitting at the table together. And this is so horrible. And then they have a really big fight because she wants to continue to see Charles, and she wants to make a deal with them where she says, you can keep her here if I can see Charles. And Ralph Fiennes is all, no, we're not doing that. That's not how things work. And then he starts being horrible to everyone, including Bess, who he seems to profess that he loves because he says that he can't make her bastards his heirs. And says that right there at the table. And I was astonished by how cruel that was. And then he maritally rapes her and impregnates her. Hooray, she's pregnant again.
Yeah, she finally has a boy on the way, but she is distraught from this encounter. She goes to this ball. I could not find any reference to this happening in real life, where she is drunk, she's swaying on her feet, and Charles James Fox, who, I want someone to make a movie about him and how charismatic and roguish and brilliant he was, starring Michael Stuhlbarg, to make you fall in love with him. He is he's a complete gentleman. He's looking after her as his friend. He dances with her like he's protecting her, but she still walks into a chandelier and her wig catches fire and the Duke is so cold.
Oh, I'm not a billion on Keira Knightley as an actress. I think she's more beautiful than a great actress, like in the scales of things. I thought she had a couple of really, really strong moments, and this was one of them. The way that she played the drunkenness and the creeping horror of realizing that her hair was on fire and layered all of that on top of like this trauma that she was carrying around. I thought that this was a great moment for her as an actor. We saw a lot of dimension to what she was experiencing in that moment. And she finally has her boy, and everybody's happy about that. William, the Duke, Ralph Fiennes, basically pays her off for finally giving her his boy, which is really cool. And
he's acting like this is perfectly normal. And again, layers of allusions to Diana. And I wondered, in that first scene where he was watching her from the window, it's like, is he just evaluating her childbearing hips, or is there some piece of him that likes the liveliness that he will subsequently work to crush?
He seems annoyed at her from the moment they meet. I don't even understand how he was able to get over that enough to marry her, because he seems just like get a load of this bitch like the whole movie. I'm curious about what got him over the hump of like saying that he would marry her, outside of like her like passing all of like the tests of like being attractive. And he goes away to go play with his dogs or something. She's hanging out at the house recovering from giving birth. She's teaching her girls how to gamble, which is fun. And she they have a party for her. Bess has a party for her, and secretly invites Charles Grey to it, pretends that he's been called back by Parliament from France, where he is fomenting revolution, I guess. They're able to hook up again, and oh boy, do they.
Yeah, so this is an insight into Bess. Just what is she playing at? And just to describe Bess's background. Again, Amanda Foreman. Bess's family, the Herveys, were not the sort that recommended themselves to Lady Spencer. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu is alleged to have said, when God created the human race, he created men, women, and Herveys. The quip could apply to each generation. Eccentric, libertine, and untrustworthy, the Herveys were an extraordinary family who had made their fortune in the early 18th century as professional courtiers.
That was an amazing quote, by the way.
The Herveys are pretty wild.
Where's that movie? I want a movie about that family. They all sound bananas.
And they're still around. Yes, the second Lord Hervey. Hervey was bisexual. He wrote passionate love letters to men. He may have had a sexual affair with Prince Frederick before their friendship dissolved. He was in fact announced as a sexually ambiguous figure in his time. That's one of her ancestors. The Herveys have had this rep all that time, alluding to the situation around this menage that we have portions of the letters blacked out, and who knows. That was something that was in her family, appreciating members of the same sex at a time when there were laws against it.
I mean, good for them. Have a good time. Life is short. They're having this affair. It goes on for a while. Her mom and Ralph Fiennes are super unhappy about it and come to see her in Bath, where she has been hooking up for some time with Charles Grey. And they're both like, and she doesn't want to, but, you know, her husband does point out that she has done it too publicly, and he's not going to stand for it, and that's that. And also says, like, you won't see your children again. And then he hands her a stack of letters from her children, which she starts reading, and she immediately packs up her things and runs home to see her children. So once again, we are seeing the threat of having your family taken from you. And like, listen, some people wouldn't care, but she clearly is a very caring and loving mother. And loves these children. So it does matter to her. There's situations where I'm sure people would be like, that's cool. You can keep the kids. I'll see them someday. But she doesn't see it as a choice when being told she can either keep Charles Grey or she can never see her children again. And Grey is very sad by this and comes stomping into her home later on after she goes back, and she's, trying to recover from the fact that she is brokenhearted. He's demanding to see her, and she's like, listen, I can't. He said I can't see my children. There's not a choice. There's some speechifying around the new world that Grey and Georgiana want. I felt like a loss of context where I wanted to, I think we know a bit about Grey's political leanings and also hers, but also like, I don't feel like we've heard them speak as thoroughly as I would like about what their vision of the future is.
This is the thing where we lost a political movie that would have made us care more about these characters because their views were in line with moving toward what we like about our world. That they're the ones who want to get rid of slavery. And they're the ones who are like, yeah, we messed up and we should just let the colonies go because this is expensive. We don't hear about that. And there's a different story. But also, again, with the way that she would throw herself into gambling addiction, and also, like, her weight was up and down, which they don't go into here because you're shooting with Keira Knightley, but she was not at liberty to tell the Duke to F off. There's also things where, like, the Duke of Dorset attempts to seduce both Georgiana and Bess, and so much soap opera going on, all of it in Jane Austen language. That was the movie I wanted to see. Even though I love the Duchess less than movies that I've only watched once or twice and won't watch again, I will probably still watch it another 2 or 3 times over the course of my life just because I love looking at it and because I love being in that world.
I don't know what you cut, and I think that it's unfortunate that there wasn't more space for the story to be told.
I wanted to see a movie about a gambling addict who was tight with Marie Antoinette. We didn't get that.
And maybe someday you will get that.
Maybe. Like, there have been 2 movies made with Cleve Jones in them. So, also, in context, given, like, the money she ran through, it talks about what, the Duke of Devonshire was worth. Georgiana's future husband was only 16 when he came into an income that was twice Lord Spencer's. By one account, it amounted to more than £60,000 per year. And he owns multiple estates. And she managed to get into a debt nearly twice as large as what her husband made in a year.
And also, it seems like gambling is her only, is her only...
Right, and it's like you're waiting for that moment of, like, blissed out adrenaline blankness, and that's what she threw herself into that, or she had affairs with people who were more emotionally present than her husband. All the while, she was about as politically powerful as you could get without being able to vote. If she were alive today, she'd be an influencer. She's the original influencer. And you see that she's a wit and everybody is eating out of her hand except her husband.
And then she announces to Bess and to the Duke that she is pregnant with Charles Grey's baby. And the Duke comes up with a solution that she is going to go away to hiding for several months, have the baby, and then give the baby away. Bess, to her credit, does say, like, I'm going with her and you cannot stop me from going with her. And so she goes with her while she goes into hiding and has this baby who is another girl. Then they basically do like it's like the scene you see in movies about drug deals where 2 people meet in the middle of a bridge. and one person throws a suitcase to one of them full of money and the other one throws a suitcase full of drugs to the other one, except it's a baby. Charles Gray's family is going to take the baby and raise the baby as their own, and they trade the baby, and it's very sad. I can't even imagine what that would be like to have not only given birth to the baby, but then, you know, she had to care for the baby for a minute while they sent carrier pigeon or whatever to the Greys to let them know that the baby was ready. And then they had to meet in the middle of nowhere to hand over the baby. That required some planning. So who the heck knows how long she had to parent this baby before handing it over to people who were going to pretend it was theirs. And it's really sad. And Knightley is, again, very good in this scene. And, you know, and Charles doesn't come, which makes sense. Like, he probably shouldn't. They shouldn't see each other. It's going to be too awful. And then she goes back home and has to act like nothing happened. And she is happy to see her children. And, you know, and Ralph Fiennes says to her, I don't like this either. It sucks. And we have a final meeting where they have a big welcome back party for her. And Gray is there, which was weird. I was kind of like, who invited him? Was that a great idea? But he was there. They have like one final exchange where he tells her that he is engaged and also that he has a new niece named Eliza, which was the name that she gave the baby, and that she's very loved.
I think having him at the party where they just speak is about creating the appearance of being above suspicion. But again, this story we didn't see. She was sent to France to have this baby out of sight. And then even after she'd had the baby, the Duke did not want her coming back to England. It took a while. While she's there, she continues to accrue tens of thousands of pounds of debts. Like, there was some figure in there that she owed 50,000 pounds in debt on the continent, which you saw that's like millions. But the years when she's in France and then leaves France for what will become obvious and is still in Europe are 1791 to 1794 that she is away from her children. So she not only made this decision that she's picking her three other children over this one child. And maybe there's a world where she and Gray run off together and they're in love, and she gives him a bunch of daughters and they make peace with having to live in a much smaller way because of what they've had to give up in that world. But instead they play the game and he gets to be Prime Minister and Earl Grey and have a tea that we still drink named after him. And I honestly think that's an okay exchange for what you can accomplish as Prime Minister. Like, who cares if two more rich people are happy or not? But what we missed is she has this, like, tearful parting with Marie Antoinette at the Tuileries, knowing everything's catching fire. And then she is an aristocrat, so gets the heck out of Paris, moves on to Nice, moves on to Switzerland and Italy, all the while accruing debt. It sounds crazy frantic. And again, other show.
Kind of an interesting time to be in France, I suppose. I want more of this character and of this person. It feels incomplete even as you're watching the movie, because you sense like so much more going on there with the characters. It's just kind of a disappointment not to have more of her, because she is interesting, and Keira Knightley does a good job bringing her to life and making her compelling to look at and to hear from. That's the end of the movie. We find out that she died when she was 49. She had a liver abscess. They don't know what caused the liver abscess. I'm sure it's something alcohol or something like that. Miscarrying a ton of babies and having a ton of babies is not great for your body. As part of her wishes, Bess and the Duke get married. and Bess is made proper Duchess, which I thought was a lovely final wish for her friend to that peculiar circumstance that they were in. And we find out that Charles Grey becomes prime minister, and as you mentioned, has a tea named after him. It's a poignant ending. And we also see her with her girls and her son and playing with them, and she's still like a very lively with them, and hopefully raising her girls to slowly and surely try and carve out a better world for women. It was a good ride.
I think that these characters being three-dimensional, even the ones that are limited and unsympathetic, like the Duke, their three-dimensionality is on the actors and not on the script.
It's interesting, too, that, you bring up all of the gambling. I feel like this movie ends kind of wholesomely for a woman who was a person of appetites and complexity and who took risks. Like, gambling is a really, really high-risk behavior.
Choice dialogue. I guess the thing that stood out to me was at the beginning, Lady Spencer gives Georgiana some terrible advice. When one truly loves someone, one doesn't have to know them well to be sure, Georgiana. One feels it right away. This is absolutely rotten advice. So bad.
I can't overstate how untrue and bad that advice is. I shared mine earlier, but I fear I've done some things in life too late and others too early. Thought that was a really poignant, sad line.
Sarah, can you please tell our listeners about how we score movies?
So we rate our movies on a 1 to 10 scale across 10 areas that we find objectively important to most films, but tailored to specific issues particular to biopics. These 10 areas are outward appearances, makeup and hair, acting and casting. Do they capture the spirit of the people they are playing? And beyond that, is the acting good? Passage of time, costuming, quality of the script, accuracy, storytelling. Was it cliched? Was it interesting? Was it inventive? Production value, production and direction decision-making, and do we care?
Then we add them up and divide by 10, because a rating out of 10 is just plain snappier than a rating out of 100. And then we average out our two scores together. We absolutely never share our scores with each other before the episode. We also use something occasionally that we call the buy, where we have the individual option to add or subtract a full point from our individual scores if we feel that the scores that we reached were not reflective of our overall enjoyment of the film. We have to decide whether to use the buy in advance of sharing scores. We can't choose it to use after the fact if we disagree as a way of mooting the other person's score partially.
And with that out of the way, let's score this thing.
So for outward appearances, I gave it an 8. Since this is too far back for people to care if anyone looks like who they're playing. And in terms of the hair and the makeup, there was the thing that I talked about where I'm going to ding it on authenticity, but I get the reasons.
Yeah, I went full force here and gave this a 10. I thought everyone looked amazing, and I loved looking at everyone, even the stupid man wigs.
Men dressed with grandeur then, and in fashion history, the French Revolution has come to be known as the Great Refusal, because it's when men start dressing more plainly. But I enjoyed seeing the same amount of fuss and embroidery on the men that women had. For acting and casting, I gave it an 8. Nobody really knocked my socks off, but on a scale of The Conqueror to anything with Meryl Streep in it, again, 8 is a very good score.
I gave it a 9.
Fantastic.
Passage of Time, I gave it a 5. It was very hard to understand how much time was passing at any given moment.
Yes, for Passage of Time, I gave it a 6 because I appreciated that they said 6 years later. That's a perfectly valid way of doing things. But there was history happening in the background that they don't really mention. You see it alluded to, but they don't show what's happening. The Devonshires were actually in France either on or close to around Bastille Day.
I mean, this was a really interesting time in Great Britain and France, as you mentioned, but also there was a lot going on in the UK and with the UK's holdings abroad in the 1780s. Costuming, I gave it a 10.
Ditto. This absolutely has deserved the Academy Award, as we said before. It is gorgeous costuming. It is absolutely an example of how to do this era.
Yeah, everything was beautiful. Quality of the script, I gave it a 6.
I did too.
Accuracy, 7.
I gave it a 4 because I read Amanda Foreman and I knew what we were missing out on.
Yeah, I kind of went high, I think, because of your omissions rule. Where like I understood why things weren't in there. Doesn't make me happy that they weren't. To your point, like throughout this, beyond even the omission, there were some accuracy issues in terms of like what people were up to. Gambling.
So maybe in going that low, I did break my own omission rule. Often the things they left out were key.
I mean, I think you make a good point, though, in terms of how it affected her.
I was so in love with what I saw in Foreman's bio that the loss of that I felt more particularly than the rules that I set up around omission versus falsehood. So for storytelling, I gave it a 5.
4.
Yeah. Middling job with great material. For production value, I gave it a full-on 10. I don't care that they didn't recreate Devonshire House because it was beyond fugly.
Same, 10.
For production, direction, decision-making, I gave it a 6. And of all the things I've cited that were great, there's an even better story that could be told here. There's something to rival Barry Lyndon in this.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you there. Like, and I gave it a 5 because it feels like it chose the wrong format for this. You know, it just feels like this should have been something else in terms of how much they had to work with and how much story there was. Do we care? I gave it a 7.
I gave it a 7 too. This was not the Georgiana I fell in love with in Foreman. I still liked these people. I was still interested, but I cared less watching this than I cared reading the biography.
Yeah, I was semi-invested in their journey, and I was also like another thing that I do want to praise the screenplay for some elements. I mean, there's a lot of like flaws in this, but I thought that they did a very good job of making you sympathetic to people who didn't necessarily deserve your sympathy. And I'm looking at you, Duke. Like at times I see that like you're not cut out for this life yourself and you don't know how to do this life well. But also he did maritally rape her and cheated on her constantly. And Haley Atwell and Bess were fascinating. And she was way more than the average, like, look, this is my second wife now. And had a lot to bring to the table too. I cared about these characters. What was your total?
7.
Mine was a 7.3.
So our average comes to 7.15. It did not rate second opinion, which I was actually quite happy that it didn't, because there's still so much that I love that I don't want to read those 1-star reviews where everyone's like, who cares about this aristocratic lady?
Yep. I would also recommend reading Marie Antoinette: A Journey by Antonia Fraser. It makes a nice bookend to the other side of this story that we didn't get to hear about in this book. And I'm also a huge fan of Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette and would recommend that as a follow-up.
I thought of Barry Lyndon. The 18th century is such a gorgeous, fascinating century for setting things in. If you want to see something that actually gave a big story the full breadth and time it deserved, produced in an era where prestige drama had space for this, HBO's John Adams, starring Laura Linney and Paul Giamatti.
Yeah, that's a good one. There's a lot of great content out there about this time period. There's also a little musical called Hamilton about what was happening in the US during this time period.
Oh, yes. Listen to Hamilton.
Yeah.
And read Amanda Foreman and watch Barry Lyndon and read Antonia Fraser.
Have
and
some tea.
Sofia Coppola. I love the I love the 18th century, although I also appreciate the 17th as an equally aesthetically brilliant dark horse that doesn't get as much attention.
So yeah, on that note, so if you like the show, please leave us a 5-star rating and subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and tell a friend, or better yet, plural friends, and share us on social media. We hear it helps. You can follow us on Instagram, where we have visual aids from our episodes. Our Instagram handle is at Biopic, a podcast story. So do check us out there, and we'll link to that in the show notes as well. Please also check out our webpage at biopicapodcaststory.podbean.com to see official episode ratings for all of the movies that we've done so far. If you would like to get in touch, you can email us at biopiclistenermailbag, all one word, @gmail.com.
Tune in next week when we'll be talking about Pride of the Yankees, where, out of respect to Lou Gehrig, I may actually say baseball every time instead of saying sports ball like I did in the Cobb episode.
You should. He deserves your respect, I think.
All right.
Okay, my dear. I will talk to you soon.
Okay, bye.